I got to practice and make sure that my mic is working so I can ask the right questions. But I'm going to ask the audience a question really quickly. How many of you know exactly what a book banning is? Raise your hand if you do. You library people, I know you know. All right, thank you. Commissioner Brown, I'm going to ask you that question. I want you to define what book banning is and give us an idea of what scope it is.
Yeah, and thank you also to the Chicago Bar Association for getting us all together, Secretary of State, and Your Honor for coming out. I think what we're talking about when we're discussing book banning, this isn't a challenge or a curiosity about whether a book should be accessible or should be read by everyone. I think what we're really talking about is an organized effort to remove books from our library collections. I think the American Library Association has just done some incredible work to really clarify the extent of that organizing. 70% of book bans across the country have come as a result of organized attempts to remove material. So for me, it's not really about a curiosity of, should my child be reading this, or is there indecency in a book? It's more about organized attempts to decide what everyone else should be reading.
Understood. And how do people go about having a book banned or restricted?
I think it depends on the library. If it's a school library, you have people showing up to boards or maybe writing letters, or in all honesty, with the extremism that we're seeing, it could be doxing people on social media. It could be really harassment. It could be calling in bomb threats. It can really run the gamut in terms of what we're seeing people responding to around these attacks on libraries.
Secretary Janulius, I don't think people, because I didn't actually when I started researching this topic, I don't think people really understand or really know about the role that the Secretary of State's office in Illinois plays in libraries. Can you tell us a bit about your role?
Yes, and again, thank you all for being here. Those of you streaming, thank you for joining on this important topic. I do want to give a shout out to my friend Chris. You know, we are very fortunate and maybe a little spoiled here in Chicago to have such a great commissioner, such an incredible public library system. We have some of the finest libraries in the United States. My kids come here to Harold Washington as one of many libraries. So we are very, very fortunate. I'm fortunate to live in the city of Chicago, and I'm fortunate enough to call Chris my friend. So thank you for all that you do on behalf of our city and our librarians. So most people don't know that the Secretary of State is the state's librarian. It's a position which I was very excited about when I decided to run for this office, having served on the board of the Chicago Public Libraries and knowing the outstanding work that our libraries do. So I was thrilled about some of the initiatives and some of the funding and some of the outside of the box ideas I had along with our incredible team. It was all positive, and then as the campaign started coming to an end and we started getting ready for transition, getting to office, this book banning stuff started rearing its dangerously ugly head. And we decided that instead of doing all the fun, happy, glowing work and me reading books to kids, we had a fight on our hands. And I know we're going to talk about it, but this piece of legislation, HB 2789, is something that I'm very proud of. And it just shows that if you can be proactive and if you have a legislature and a governor that is supportive of the freedom of speech and the freedom to learn, and you have great allies, you can become a national leader on a topic. So I'm honored to be the state librarian. I can't believe we have to talk about book banning in the year 2023, but it's important, and it's important for people to be on the right side of history.
Well, let's go right there. You had the opportunity to go to the nation's capital and talk about this very unique law that we have that was just recently signed into place that you had a lot to do with. Can you tell us a bit about the legislation, HB 2789, that is now the law of the state of Illinois?
Well, first of all, if you haven't seen my testimony at the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate, don't let your kids watch it, but I encourage everyone who's above 18 years old or whatever to watch it. Because while it was funny and crazy and odd, it was dangerous to see how, and again, I wish this wasn't a political matter, but to see how Republican leadership, who in the past had always been in favor of, quote, freedom of speech, tries to change the subject and turn this into a child porn issue, which is not the case, has never been the case, and has nothing to do with HB 2789. So now to answer your question, we noticed what was going on, and we thought, how can we be proactive and be a national leader on this subject? So we started doing some homework. We put together with our amazing team this bill, the first in the United States of America, that said you will not get state grant funding if you ban books. We got it passed out of the House, got it passed out of the Senate. It was signed in this building on June 12th of this year, and since then we've had an outpouring of support. Other states have reached out to us, and the outpouring of support we've gotten from librarians has been really tremendous. And this, to me, is about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but it's also about protecting our librarians. And the reason this legislation came to us was because as I was traveling the state, meeting with different librarians, traveling and talking to libraries, their lives have been upended like nothing they've ever seen before. Threats, physical threats, intimidation, being forced to quit, libraries being forced to close their doors because of a couple unruly fringe extremists. So you have librarians who should be put on a pedestal being scared for their lives. And that was the impetus behind the bill. And I just want all the librarians to know that we will fight for them here in Illinois to continue doing their job and to continue to be heroes to our young people and to everyone who walks in the library door.
So as I understand it, I think you gentlemen both agree that when we're talking about banning books, what you're talking about is actually removing literature from the shelves and the availability of public libraries. But you're not saying, either one of you, that there shouldn't be some restrictions on some books in some cases, are you?
So let me take this before the commissioner does, because this is also important, because both in Springfield and in Washington, the other side try to turn this into, you're trying to tell us what our kids should be reading. And the truth of the matter is that has nothing to do with our bill. Nothing in our bill is forcing librarians or libraries or schools to tell them what books kids should be reading. The only point of our bill is we can't let someone based on personal or partisanship or fear or hatred, one person determine what book is in circulation for an entire community. So we trust our librarians who have degrees in library science, degrees in Masters of Library and Information Science to determine what books are in circulation. So all we're saying is let's continue doing what we've always done, which is let librarians and those with the professional judgment and experience determine the circulation of their libraries. Sorry, Chris.
No, one thing I just want to add, and I think that's so important about the bill that the Secretary and the Governor introduced, is there have been these organized efforts to remove those stories from our libraries, but there hasn't been a lot of teeth in terms of the librarian side, in terms of what we can do. And so I think we've messaged about our values, and we've maybe stood up to not removing material, but having an actual law that's an organized effort to have a response to these removals is, I think, incredibly important. And you can look at states like Texas or states like Florida, where they have introduced laws or board policies for their schools where they're saying, you can't teach this book, or you can't require my child to learn about this part of our history. So I think it's very important as a state to make sure that we have legislation and additional legislation, like the governor saying there's requirements now to teach Native American history in our schools. I think that organized effort is critical to have as a response.
Let's talk about banning books, or those books that are being banned nationally and certainly in some states. Do you believe that book bans disproportionately target racial and LGBTQIA+ individuals or subjects?
I'm sure Chris had, it's not a belief or an opinion, it's a fact. These are the books that are being banned on exactly these issues, and they've gone even further. I'm sure you know more about the statistics, but a lot of these communities and a lot of these sort of fringe extremists aren't really masking the books that they're trying to ban.
Yeah, I don't think it's any secret. It's our more diverse authors, LGBTQ plus authors, especially BIPOC authors, who are getting targeted for these removals. And just because we are here with a program that's put on by the Chicago Bar Association, I do think there's some interesting legal elements to these book bans. There is a Library Use Protection Act. So we don't know what Lexi checks out. I don't know what you check out from the library. And so we've had those sort of legal stipulations in place to sort of protect use of the library. And so I think it's fascinating to see these efforts to remove material when we already have these legal protections in place to make sure that everyone can borrow and explore their interests, and it has nothing really to do with us or the library, and there's legal protections for that.
In Illinois, there are, people might be surprised that there are some areas that certain books are banned within Illinois. What books, or what types of books are those that are being banned in Illinois?
So again, the books that on issues.
I won't ask you to read anything. Your staff promised me not to read any books or any excerpts from books, but you might want to give us an idea of what we're talking about.
There have been attempts to ban books like Of Mice and Men, 1984, The Kite Runner. And it's true. These books are, there are individuals that want to ban these books. And I think, Chris talks about the legal element of it. We talk about, the details of why it's wrong. But the truth of the matter is, especially now, when our young folks are dealing with mental health crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen, and we see isolation and depression and loneliness and a confusion of where kids belong in society and social media, and something that will take a lot longer than this panel discussion tonight. But this is a time when we need books more than ever. Books help fight isolation. They help young men and women see different viewpoints, see a different worldview, understand empathy, kindness. They have an opportunity to look in the mirror and see a viewpoint or someone that maybe provides them courage and confidence. And here we are with record numbers of suicide and depression and loneliness, and you have people saying, let's make it even more challenging for these kids who, for so many, a library is their sanctuary, is their safe place. And it also fundamentally goes against what education is all about, which is teaching children to think for themselves. And when you tell them what books they can't read, and you pull books that have historical value, you're really doing tremendous damage to our democracy, you're doing damage to our future, and it flies in the face of what has made this the greatest country in the world, which is freedom of speech and the freedom to learn.
And I'm partial. I think we're getting to live in one of the greatest cities in the world, and I think a lot of these bans, in my mind, getting to serve in this role as commissioner, they're kind of an assault and an insult on the legacy of librarians in our Chicago greater area. So we have librarians like Charlemagne Hill Rollins and Vivian Harsh, who really built up our African American history collection, which is the largest collection aside from Schaumburg in New York. And so they spent all this time thinking about what are the kinds of books our diverse kids want to have access to, and really thinking about building a storehouse of diverse narratives. And now to see those efforts and these attacks so blatantly, I also see it as sort of an erosion of the legacy and values we've built up.
One of the important issues that I think that we're trying to present here is to show how the public can be involved in their libraries, generally and specifically regarding their content. How can the public get involved, express their own opinions in terms of what books should be restricted or if they should be restricted at all? Can you give me an idea of how they can be more involved
Yeah,
from
we
that
love to
perspective?
know what people want us to buy. Like that's always a great conversation. Like, could you look at including this book in your collection? I think we're always open to people challenging why a book's in the collection. And usually there's a whole host of reviews that we've put together, and our librarians really are stewards of the public good. And so they're looking at the latest literature, they're looking at trends in purchasing. They want to make sure that the most relevant material is in our city's neighborhood libraries. And so people can always submit those concerns, but usually we're able to point to the expertise of our staff, our kind of collection development practices, and we usually feel really confident about what we've purchased.
Do you ever go out into the communities or try to encourage or engage them in terms of what their thoughts are?
I really think we're in this very polarized moment where book banning is getting politicized. Most of my early career, you rarely saw book challenges. Like I'm dating myself, but like, I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago, I'd serve on our collection development committee, and we would get together, and there might be like one book challenge every maybe 6 months. Someone would say, yeah, I don't know if this book is right to have in our library, and we would put together like a case on why it was purchased and all the reviews, and probably more than 9 times out of 10, the response was, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We see why you purchased it. But I think we're in this moment where we haven't had to traditionally do this. We haven't had to go out in the community and ask, do you feel this is a problematic material? Because I think just historically, we've been entrusted to kind of do our job.
It's less than, and don't get me wrong about my question. My question was not about how to keep books out, but how to maybe encourage a library to bring more books in.
Yeah.
More books, certainly in the 50s and 60s when, as a young African-American kid, not seeing many African-American books in my school, let alone in the libraries. How can you encourage people to say, hey, we got this book, or do you do any round tables or any other kind of public engagement
I think in Chicago, we're so fortunate to have neighborhood libraries all across our city. 81 libraries, 77 neighborhoods. And so we have staff that are constantly in the community. They're constantly working with schools, working with our alders, working with community-based organizations, and getting all kinds of feedback about what we should be purchasing. And then we actually provide our individual branches with a budget so they can make those more localized decisions.
Money
about
helps. Money helps.
Yep. So like, what do they want to purchase for their local neighborhood? So we really entrust our staff to kind of exercise that autonomy.
If I could take a stab at answering your question too, and Chris's answer is perfect, but with respect to what can people do, it's terrifying that this has become political. I wish it hasn't, but I would tell people to get even more engaged. Call your senator, call your U.S. rep, call your state rep, state senator, mayor, go to a library board meeting. Tell them why this issue is so important. And all the polling that we've seen suggests that people by a very large number fundamentally are against the concept of book banning. By a large number, in the 70% and above, are against book banning.
From both parties.
Right.
Yep.
Allegedly. Right. So when people are all in favor of this, but a select few are causing all this ruckus and are influencing legislation, and as we mentioned earlier, you have these folks in Missouri who are taking flamethrowers to books, that is allowing the voice of a few rowdy extremists to take over an issue that most people agree is bad for our democracy. So the fact that all of you are here tonight is important. Be involved. Go to the library, tell your librarian how proud you are of them. push on this issue. Go online, push back, and remind people what's really at stake. And I think that's important. You can't just sit back and say, "Oh, this book banning is really horrible," then just go on to the next thing. We need people to step up, to stand up, and to use their voices.
Thank you. Libraries can be not only a hub for learning and creativity, they can also be a hub for access, I think, for people. And I know, Secretary Julius, your office is engaged in a program that's connected with Chicago Bar Foundation, the libraries, to give access to the courts. And the court, I can't leave out the courts. The courts are involved in this as well. Can you talk little bit about the effort to try to increase the access to the courts through the libraries?
Yes, and this is a shout out to the judges and to our court system for reaching out to us and finding ways to use our libraries to provide equitable access to the legal system. Not everyone lives across the street from a courthouse. As a matter of fact, in some rural communities, people live very far away from their courthouse. Not everyone has the ability to take off work to, deal with a traffic ticket or a family court issue. So one of the projects that our incredible team is working on is working with libraries, working with the court system to provide training to librarians to help individuals and their families have access to the legal system physically at our libraries. I'm very excited about it. We have some work to do, but this is the first time, to our knowledge, that this has ever happened. And this is, again, one of 1,000 examples of how our libraries play such a critical role in every single community, whether you live in a small rural town, whether you live on the west side of Chicago. That's why we need to do everything we can to protect these libraries. These librarians, and Chris can speak to this too, they aren't just people who check out books. They are teachers, they are tutors, they are mentors, they are therapists, they are counselors, they are they're family members. And to see this attack on them is horrible for our country.
I just want to echo what Alexia mentioned about the importance of writing your congresspersons, writing your representatives. I think what the Secretary of State said about this organized attack on libraries, it's really also an organized attack on our public because it's impacting what they have access to, right? Our librarians are really stewards, but these attacks are really an impact and influence on what is it like to live in America? What do you have access to? There have also been some, I think, great initiatives to kind of think about how do we support our librarians. So the American Library Association, they put out a campaign called Unite Against Book Bans. And then Chicago has put out one called Book Sanctuary. You can go to booksanctuary.org, learn more about how you can really champion, frequently challenge, or ban books in your community. But there are efforts to really kind of push back and stand up for the values that drive our work and make sure that we're looking out for our public having access to vibrant, diverse voices.
Excellent. I want to try to get the audience involved a little bit here and see if we can't get some questions from the audience to our speakers today. Yeah, feel free. And you people who were looking at us online, I think there's a way in which you can ask questions as well. Please feel free. All right. Okay. This is, I think, to Secretary Janulius. The question is, has Illinois' law, this recent law, been challenged yet in the courts, and how are you preparing for the challenge?
That's a great question. It has not been challenged yet. We have an outstanding legal team. We have a great legislative team. I hope it doesn't happen, but we are 100% prepared for that. Great question.
The next question, again, is does this new law, does it apply to school libraries as well as the public libraries?
Yes, anyone that is asking for state funding or seeking state funding or has the ability to get state funding is included in our legislation.
I think part of something that I read of the legislation includes the ALA's Bill of Rights. Can you tell us a bit about their Bill of Rights?
Yeah. So they established their Bill of Rights in 1939. So Chicago Public Library, we were actually the first public library in the country to put out an intellectual freedom statement in 1936. And this was really at the height of McCarthyism. And then ALA followed suit. I think it really just specifies the role of a library in sort of protecting access to our material. As our Secretary of State mentioned, it really makes sure that we're not allowing partisan interests to influence what we take off of our shelves. But it also, one of the things that I find most interesting about it is it specifies that libraries should be actively working with other groups and individuals to champion access to material. So I really appreciate the work the Secretary has done to bring in more voices to sort of protect our freedom to read.
One of the questions that one of our audience members has is, the question is, who are the experts that are deciding which books should be taught or displayed even?
The librarians. They go to school, they get their master's degree, they learn all about intellectual freedom. They, as I mentioned, look at all kinds of data about trends and interests and what do our public want to read. Most of what we purchase has very little to do with a librarian's individual taste. It has to do with what do publishing trends say that our public want.
So here's the question, and it might be to both of you. Library boards are being attacked by, that's okay, are being attacked by individuals. And what are the ways in which you are supporting the librarians and their staff?
I think it is an incredibly difficult time right now where librarians are seeing all this social media, all of these vocal, whether they're threats or whether they're being called out as groomers or really being vilified. I think there is a moment right now where we have to figure out as a field, how are we championing our staff? How are we giving them the mental health care, the care and feeding that they need as a field while they're on the front lines doing this work? So here in Chicago, we have a recently formed immediate response team that's sort of thinking about as a workforce, how do we as a board and a library leadership team work together to kind of figure out what do our workforce need during all these challenges?
Here's a question, and I'm going to ask both of you. What is your stance on books containing misinformation about vaccinations or races or anti-LGBTQ plus information?
Well, personally, I'm not in favor of some of those topics. But again, this goes to the fundamental question of trusting our librarians to determine what books belong in circulation. And also, you can't say freedom of speech and freedom to learn, and it can only be my viewpoint. I think that's an important point to make. This has always been a democracy that allows differing viewpoints and different voices, and if just because I disagree with them doesn't mean they should not exist. I do think one of the things that some of the folks are trying to change the subject on, and we saw this in testimony of our bill, we had a legislator on the other side say, well, Mr. Janulius wants to have books on how to build a bomb in the library. And so we're like, no, that exceeds freedom of speech. That's not what we're doing. And again, we're not saying that those books belong. I'm not saying that every single book belongs. That's not one of them. But that's, again, a misdirection play to try and talk about a book that librarians don't want in circulation anyway.
We have whole collection development plans in libraries that really specify what we purchase, what we collect, right? And so we try to purchase material that's accurate. Like, we don't want health information on our shelves that's not accurate, or legal information on our shelves that's not accurate. So we strive for accuracy. That said, if there are voices on different sides of the political divide, we would include those if there's that demand for it. If that's what our public want to read, we have a responsibility to make it available.
What would you hope to see nationwide to happen after this particular debate that's going on all over the country? What would you like to see happen?
I would like to, one of the most disconcerting parts of this journey to get this bill passed and going to Capitol Hill, and maybe again I was naive, seeing the partisan divide has really been upsetting to me. And the fact that our bill passed, but we didn't have one Republican vote, not one. And I just don't understand how it's a Democrat-Republican issue. And as we worked on this legislation, as we worked with our allies, not once did our team ask if an author was a Democrat or Republican. Not once did I ask if a librarian was a Democrat or Republican. And not once did we ask a constitutional expert or lawyer whether they were a Democrat or Republican. Yet, across the board, unequivocally, every single person we spoke to agreed that book banning was dangerous for our democracy, dangerous for our state and our nation's future, and dangerous for our young boys and girls. So then you go to take a vote on this issue, and all the Republicans are against it. And then you go to Capitol Hill, and you've got a senator screaming about child porn and how Alexi wants child porn in schools. You're like, what is going on here? What is happening? How has this become a political football? So to answer your question, in a perfect world, people would come together. The people who say that they believe in freedom of speech will act that way. We'll stop these horrifyingly dangerous bomb threats at our libraries. We'll stop intimidating our librarians. Regardless of what political party you are and where you live, you will hold our librarians on a pedestal, and we will support our schools, our librarians, our libraries. Last piece I'll say is, as a parent of 3 young kids, of course there are certain books that I don't want my kids, that are not age appropriate for my kids. And my wife and I will make sure that they don't read them. I'm sure Chris has a similar.
I have a 10-month-old, so he's not reading
Right.
I got a little bit of time.
You'll get there.
Yeah, we'll be there soon, yeah.
But again, the point of this is we have to trust librarians and parents. And just because there are certain books that I don't want my 3 daughters to read doesn't mean that I have a right to tell any other parent what books their kids should and should not read. That's the whole premise of our legislation. That's the whole backbone of this debate, which I feel like the other side is losing. But again, they've got some very loud voices.
What's your favorite banned book?
I feel like that's hard. That's hard for me. I feel like as a librarian, I'm always in this like mode of like what matches the reader. I think The Hate You Give, just timely and topical, and I have an appreciation for our youth wanting to tell these stories and read these stories, and I think that's an important time to be a young adult, to see and read stories that resonate with your experience and that draw you in. And I like seeing that. I like seeing stories that youth gravitate to and feel like this is an important narrative for them.
Kite Runner.
I'll give my answer too. I understand To Kill a Mockingbird is one of the books is on the ban list, and that was the first One Book, One Chicago book over 20 years ago,
and it's still making its rounds.
It's
in,
still making
in
its rounds.
controversy.
That's right. Let's see. Well, you got time to wrap it up. What do
So, Judge, let me just add one point to the last piece, because I think, when we talk about To Kill a Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men, Kite Runner, The Hate You Give, as books that are being banned, people are kind of shocked. And this again goes back to the fundamental importance of this issue. This is important to me as a parent, as an American, as the son of 2 immigrants, as the state's librarian, because it's more than just books and a couple books that we love, which we could get access to anyway. It's the slippery slope of what comes next. And what we've seen is the book bans, people lighting books on fire, which may remind people of another tragic time in our world history. But right now, there are plays across the country that are being canceled. They're canceling plays that they don't like. And there is an even instance of the Addams Family, a play, a musical at a kid's school that one parent said is too dark and too negative and it should be removed, and they removed the play. So this goes beyond books. And so to me, it's not just this fight, but what fight is coming next? What are these people really after? That's the scary part. And that's to try and reinforce why we need people to step up, to stand up, and to take this issue so serious. It can't be just a laughable, oh, I can't believe these people are doing it, and going to bed. We have to step up and fight.
And just to build on what you said about these bans being beyond books, in Chicago Public Library, some of the attempted censorship we've seen is also about our programming. So putting on programming where it's LGBTQ plus themed and it's about fashion and youth, designing fashion, that's been targeted by groups like Gays Against Groomers. So I agree. I think it's beyond just books. We see drag queen story times being targeted for those shouldn't be going on. But I think for me, my sense is that libraries right now, they are under an organized threat, and we need an organized response and advocacy on behalf of libraries and librarians. And it's what makes this bill so important to Illinois and the country.
One of the questions was, what's the best, most effective way to try to tamp down this extremism and keep libraries and other things open for people? What are the most effective ways?
Again, advocacy. I feel from a political standpoint, again, reaching out to legislators, reaching out to leaders, going to library board meetings, running for office, also going online, telling your friends and neighbors why this is fundamentally damaging for the future of this democracy. I think it's important to use your voices.
There's an organized expression of kind of vitriol against libraries right now, and this sort of villainizing of librarians. I think, Alexi, what you mentioned about we need to counteract that with this kind of show of support. All of this sort of counteracting presence at board meetings or expression of appreciation to librarians across the country.
So in other words, don't be quiet. Don't be silent.
Yes, correct.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you. Thank you both
Thank
so
you all
much
so
for
much.
coming. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.